Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. Today I will be talking about Book 3 of the Edan trilogy, Return to Edan by fellow booktuber Philip Chase. While this will be a spoiler-free review, this is the third book in a trilogy, so I will be mentioning some things about the previous two books, but I will do my best to make sure I don't really spoil anything. Obviously, there will be mentions of characters who are in this book, so maybe some characters in previous books didn't make it all the way, or vice versa, so you will have to take that into account for this review. But with that being said, what is this book about? And I've just taken this from Goodreads, so there shouldn't be any spoilers here, but from the ashes of the War of the Way arises chaos, and a new menace swarms over the battle-raged kingdoms of Eldermon, while disease and violence claims thousands. But the greatest threat to Eldermon is its savior. Stark choices confront Dayraven's friends as they race to salvage what they can of their world. So now with all of that preamble out of the way, let's go ahead and get into what my overall thoughts for this book was. And I had a great time with this book. This is my favorite book of the trilogy. I think it is pretty close between book 2 and 3, but I do think 3 just has some of that extra spiritual touch. And there's actually a character that gets introduced into this book that I just absolutely loved. And so that kind of elevates it above book 2 for me. Book 2 does have all of that great action, and there is so much of it in there. There's a lot of that traditional action fantasy and stuff. But this book is very different. It takes a different approach, and it was very refreshing. This book definitely, or the series in general, definitely has its roots in what most people would consider a traditional fantasy sense. But there's definitely a unique spin and twist into it. I think a lot of that does come from some of the Eastern philosophies that are brought into it, and I quite enjoyed that, and I think this book definitely represents that the most out of the trilogy. This book has a lot of really beautiful and self-introspective moments in it that kind of make you think as you're reading, and I really enjoy that. It just gives you some scenarios and some thoughts that, as you're going through, you can kind of see how you would apply that to yourself. And just, there's obviously a big sense of oneness and togetherness in this series, but specifically in this book, and I really enjoyed that. Philip was able to do some things in here that when he was first introducing them into the story, I was super worried about. I think he specifically, and we'll get to it a little bit more with the characters, he did something that is something that can go so wrong. And it's a trope, or not even, I don't even think I would call it a trope, but it is something that authors have done in the past that completely derails series for me, and that is introducing a brand new character this late into a story. And it's so hard for me to say if she's my favorite character or not. I think she might be number 2, but the fact that a character is introduced into the last book, plays a prominent role, and is done as well as it is just fantastic. And like I said, it's normally not something that I like because, we're book 3 and we have characters we care about. We have, people we're attached to. And so to be able to introduce a new one, get me as attached to her as anybody else and to care, I think it's just super well done. And I will say, just what an ending to this actual book. Obviously the trilogy as a whole, great ending, but the actual ending of this book was very cathartic, super well done. And it's an ending that is going to stick with me for a super long time. It was, you wanna have the tissues ready for when you get to that part of the book. Just so much is happening and so much going on with so many different characters. It's just fantastic, and I thought it was super well done. So with all of that being said, I gave this book a 4-star rating, and most months this would have been my book of the month. I read this last month, and unfortunately it just went up against some super heavy hitters and just missed out on book of the month, but it's super good. I'm super glad I finally got around to finishing it and am excited to see what he does next. So now let's go ahead and dive a little bit deeper here. I'm going to break things up into writing/prose, plot, and then characters is where I have the most to say. So I'll finish up with characters because I basically have something to say about most of the main characters in this story. So like I said, let's go ahead and start with prose and writing. Now, I'm not really the person who should be talking about writing and prose. I do not have an English degree or anything like that. But as a reader, I normally look at it as most prose is just a blank neutral. It doesn't elevate the story and it doesn't lower the story. In very rare cases, that can happen. Wherever I'm thinking of a Janny Wirtz, I think her writing, her actual use of the English language elevates the story. And I actually don't have a good example for prose that I think really hurts the story. So, which is a good thing. And I think if I had to rate the writing and prose in this book, I would put it as a neutral plus. So on the plus side for sure. It is a very readable format. It's not going to be like super complex and difficult to figure out or to follow or anything like that. I will say there are definitely some very beautiful passages in here. Some of that is related to like the philosophy and stuff that's going on, but then there is also just some like really great descriptors of things going on. There's one that to me just worked so beautifully in my head, and I wish I had it highlighted on my Kindle. I wish I could remember it exactly, but it's the way he describes soldiers coming through trees. And for whatever reason, that was just like so vivid. I could picture it perfectly in my head. And so there are definitely some examples of that going on. Okay, let's move on to something a little bit more exciting than just the writing, and that is going to be the plot. So to me, the plot took a little bit of a backseat for my level of care in this book, and that does not mean the plot is bad. Far from it. The plot is still very good in this book. I think it's just that the characters were so powerful and were like the shining star for me in this book that while the plot was still good, it's not that I didn't care. That's not the right way to say it. It's more of a attachment to the characters that made whatever was happening in the story to me was going to be fine. Now, with the plot in this book, I wasn't sure exactly what was going to happen because the second book in the trilogy really feels like the end of an arc. Like if you were going to talk about this trilogy, it would almost be like book 1 and 2 are an arc and book 3 is an arc, at least to me. Obviously, there's very strong through lines. Book 3 literally starts like right after the end of book 2, but it just felt very different because the climax of the second book finishes off a lot of things that in a more traditional story, the story would have ended there, and we really wouldn't have gotten this like falling action that we do. Obviously, there was still a lot to be resolved at the end of that second book, but there are plenty of times where we don't get enough things wrapped up at the end of the series, and that is what could have happened there at the end of that book. I think I even said something similar in my Prophet of Edan review, and so I was really curious on what was going to happen. And it honestly went in a direction I was not expecting whatsoever. You have this exploration of Dayraven dealing with the consequences of what has afflicted him since book 1. You have other characters going and doing things and trying to rescue their people, try to find themselves in a sense, and then you have the whole other plotline of the barbarian army that is coming in and, trying to attack and, further their own gains. So there's a lot going on in this book, and that was another one of those things that I talked about where I wasn't sure how everything was going to come together in a cohesive way. I remember at one point being maybe like 40% of this book and just being like, there's so much still left to happen in this book. How in the world is he going to be able to wrap all of these things up and make them work in a cohesive way? And he does. To no one's surprise as I'm kind of gushing about this book, he is very much able to make it all come together and work in a way that is satisfying and enjoyable, which is great. So now let's go ahead and get to like the real meat and potatoes here, because I don't want to say too much about the plot because obviously that is super spoiler dependent. But now we have to get to the characters, and I'm going to have to look at my notes for some of this because I did write up some notes about each individual character. And the first character I want to talk about, and this kind of almost relates back to the plot a little bit, where this book picks up in kind of a different place, and that character is Serene. I'm going to say that's what she's called. At least that's how I have pronounced her name the entire time. Don't know if that is actually correct, but we get introduced to this new character, and at first I thought she was just going to be the introduction to the plague that is going to cause havoc everywhere. And while she is that, she is much more. She is such a strong character for being put through the trials and tribulations she is put through in this book. She is just, I don't know, I became super attached to her very quickly. And as I mentioned, a lot of times when an author tries to introduce a new character into a book this late, it just doesn't work for me. And I think I'm probably going to have to put her in number 2. We'll get to my favorite character here in a little bit. But to be able in one book jump all the way up to number 2 and just be this lovable character that, you just want like good things for, you feel for her. You want her to be like safe and protected and to like have joy and, because some horrible things happen to her. It's just, she's such a well done character. She plays a pivotal role in the story. She's not just a bystander. She's not just somebody there recanting tales. She is actively involved, and I think and this is not going to be a spoiler, but for those of you who have read this book and are for some reason watching this, the seeds of her journey and what she does in the book is set up from like the very first thing we interact with her. And I just thought that was just one of those super nice things where like it's one of those breadcrumbs that an author gives to you, and when we get to that point in the story, I was able to be like, oh, this is exactly what she's going to do, and it was set up super early on. And that's just a huge prop for that character development where you're showing a character strength and then giving them the opportunity to use it super late into the book. Super well done for her. Oh, and one other thing I do want to mention, with her, the plague is introduced to us that, affects a lot of people, and that is some of the amazing writing in here. The actual plague stuff that Philip writes in here, like very selfishly, I would love to see Philip write like a super dark medieval, like very light fantasy. Maybe like there's like a witch in the woods kind of scenario, but like a medieval village dealing with the plague. Like, I don't know. I think that would just be incredible, because I think that and some other things he wrote with another character, which we'll get to, it was some of the best writing in here. And I would be super interested to see him do almost like a horror gothic, horror medieval kind of tale, because some of the plague stuff that he ends up writing in here with Serene is like next level stuff, and it's super good. And actually, let's go ahead and jump to the character that made me think that even more. So Bagsack, the character, there is some super dark and creepy stuff that happens with him. First of all, him as a character I found to be super interesting. Obviously, he is introduced in the first book, and we're seeing him there, and some of the worst stuff that you could possibly imagine happens to him. I can't say I felt bad for him completely, because I'm not the most forgiving when it comes to characters if I think they're a bad person or something like that. But some of the things that did happen to him were just like next level horrible. And some of the writing around some of the things he deals with, super well done. And that is part of why I would love to see like a super dark, gritty story written by Philip, because I really think he has the ability to do it, and I would love to see it. But once again, going back to him as a character, it is hard to believe that I did feel a little bit bad for him. Not all the way, like I said, but he is used as such an interesting way to explore the magic in this world that it's not something I even knew I wanted, but I did find it incredibly interesting. And he is like the opposite of character growth. He kind of devolves, and it's like a forced de-evolution, actually. And I think it was a really interesting way to like kind of destruct this character to be something completely different. And I don't know, he's kind of a side character throughout, but he is going to be a character that I think about all the time because of the things that happened to him. It's going to be hard for me to forget the things that he went through. Just like Serene, she is also just one of those characters who I think I'm going to think about a lot. I don't know, I just needed to bring him up as well, even though he is much more of a side character. And the next character, let's go ahead and talk about Dayraven now. And I say it like that because what an interesting character. You want to talk about a character that goes on a journey from book one to the end of a book. I won't say it's on the same level as Rand from the Wheel of Time. I mean, he's my favorite character of all time. But if you look at where Dayraven is at the start of book one and where he is at the end of book three, it is pretty mind-blowing, the transformation that the character goes on. He, obviously he's the typical farm boy, all those tropes that not every fantasy story, but a lot of fantasy stories have. And to see him grow and change into the character that he becomes, it is quite a remarkable journey. Now, I will say, I didn't really like Dayraven until this book. I always kind of had mixed feelings towards him as a character, and I think part of that is intentional. I think he is supposed to be kind of a hard to like, I don't want to say ignorant because that's not the right way, but he is kind of ignorant of how the world works. And he is a little frustrating, and he does make dumb decisions, and he kind of makes you want to like just face palm and, so many things. But by the end of this book, he is transformed. He is this different person with different things, and and his interactions with some other characters are just so heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time. I mean, there are some things that happen with him, and I won't say which characters for spoiler reasons, but man, they just pull on your heartstrings, but also make you so happy at the same time. And so he is another character. I don't know if he's probably like, if I had to rank him as a character, he's probably like fourth or fifth of my favorites, which is an interesting thing to say as a character who is pretty much the predominant character throughout the trilogy. But like I said, he goes from this insufferable person who I did not like to somebody, I guess I think a good way to say it is, because is an interesting way to say it. I definitely enjoyed him, but I definitely admired Dayraven by the end of book three. And I think that is maybe a more positive compliment that I can give to Dayraven than just saying I liked him as a character. I think he was very admirable. He did things that were hard and had this outlook on life that I just think is very positive and just, I don't know, a good outlook to have. And obviously some of that is plot related and story related, but character growth is character growth, and I think that it was very well done and impressively done as well. Taking a character from where he was to where he ends up is not an easy feat, and I'm glad I got to go along on that journey with Dayraven. And now we have to talk about my favorite character, my main girl, Sakura. She she goes through a lot too. It is impressive how much Philip is able to make these characters go through in just a trilogy, but I really appreciated seeing how powerful she is in this book. And I don't just mean powerful in like a sense of the magic, but also as a leader and like a force for her people. And that's something I really admired about her, this drive she had. There are some tough choices she really does have to make throughout this book. And I think her resolve to do what she feels duty calls her to do and what is best, not necessarily for herself. She could have been very selfish and make choices for herself that I think people wouldn't fault her for, right? She definitely could have done and said things that were for her, and she doesn't. She goes the hard way. She does things that necessarily aren't going to give her a selfish sense of reward, but one for the greater good. And I think that's a super powerful thing. And I will also say, I think Philip does a really good job of, and this is something I've seen Bookborn talk about a few times, where masculine traits are given to female characters, and that is what we say makes them like a good character, right? I'm thinking of somebody like Arya from A Game of Thrones, where a lot of masculine traits are given to her, which there's nothing wrong with that. But I do like seeing that I think Philip was able to keep some of that femininity of Sakura in here and just kind of show that, like, yes, she is a woman, but like she is also just good at what she's trying to do and a competent leader and all these things. And I think that's a difficult thing to do. I think too often we throw away those traditional traits because we want to give them like masculine traits because for whatever reason those are seen to be more positive. I hope this is making sense. But I just really enjoyed seeing all those different layers of her, how complicated of a character she is, and how people are willing to follow her, and just how just strong she is. And I mean that in like every sense of the word of being strong. And unfortunately with her, I really feel I can't express a lot of the things about her that I really appreciated in a spoiler-free way. So we will go ahead and move on away from her. And I kind of have, I have the rest of the people kind of broken down into a group. So there is Orvindal, Abon, Gorn, and Galandor, kind of all together as one group. I enjoyed their party. I really enjoyed Ovendil, I think that's how I'm gonna pronounce it. I really enjoyed him probably the most out of that group, probably him, then Galandor, Gorn, and Abon. And the reason for that is there is this continual thread around him of this bloodlust that he wants to fight. And I really enjoyed that because I think that's a trait a lot of times an author would have a character, not that he doesn't overcome it, but they would try to distance themselves from that. And if you really think about it, that is an integral part of his character. It's a part of his culture in this world. How important being a warrior is, I think, is just like next level. And so to have that mentioned multiple times about how he thirsts for the battle and all of these things, I think it was super well done. And it is another one of those things that I think is just going to kind of stick with me, that there's a character who can see this, I'm going to call it a flaw, but he sees this thing that is maybe detrimental to himself and the people he is with, and yet can't help himself. And I think it's a really powerful thing to just like examine. And, I think it also just shows that this book isn't full of perfect people. There are too many things in too many books where people are just kind of perfect. They're the stereotypical good. There's no gray. And I think with many of these characters, that gray is examined a pretty good deal, and I really enjoyed that. That's kind of a blanket statement, but I think for me, it just hit me a little bit harder with him as a character and just that battle lust that he is struggling with. He kind of reminded me of the opposite of Dalinar from Stormlight Archive. If you're not familiar with Stormlight Archive, Dalinar is a grizzled veteran who has kind of turned away from the traditional kind of violence. He's kind of seen the light that I think you see in a lot of stories where you have that kind of trope of the person who's been through war over and over again and is tired of the killing. And to me, he's like the opposite of that. He's been through it, he knows, and yet he still wants it. He still thirsts for it. And I just found that really interesting. And I know I'm not even gonna go down the rabbit hole of Stormlight there with what I just said, but yeah, I just thought that was super interesting. For the rest of the characters, they all have their own little story arcs. It's more of the party together than any individual character. Obviously, there are some things that happen with all of them, but I don't feel the need to go into them. Those are really my highlights of the character. So I guess I'll go ahead and start wrapping this up. In the end, if you have not read this trilogy, I think you absolutely should. It is absolutely worth your time. It is a great series. Each book gets better and better. And there are some really strong themes and messaging and characters and just everything you want in a fantasy story is here. I mean, literally, like, it's hard for me to imagine people who like most fantasy books to not enjoy this trilogy as a whole. And also, if you're open to exploring some deeper themes, like that is there. You don't need to do it. Like you can kind of gloss over it and look at it more of a surface level. But I definitely think that there are some deeper themes that you can really get into and enjoy. And I don't know, I really enjoyed it. Like I said, this was a solid 4-star book for me. Let me know if you have plans to read this trilogy, and if you have already read it, let me know what you think down below in the comments. And as always, have a good one.